In the early years of the 19th century, Edinburgh stood proudly at the peak of European medicine. Its narrow streets echoed not only with carts and church bells, but with ideas, dangerous, ambitious ideas about the human body. This was a city where anatomy theaters were packed to the ceiling, where young men leaned forward with burning eyes as professors spoke of muscles, nerves, and organs as if they were unlocking the very code of life itself. Surgeons sharpened their blades and their theories at the same time, convinced that understanding the body meant mastering it, and mastering it meant progress. To study medicine in Edinburgh was to stand at the frontier of science, where ignorance was being carved away layer by layer. But beneath this brilliance lay a rot no one liked to name. Anatomy was not a luxury, it was the foundation of modern medicine. You could not heal what you did not understand, and you could not understand the body without opening it. Yet the law lagged far behind science. By statute, only the bodies of executed criminals could be legally dissected. Murderers, thieves, the condemned, these were the few whose corpses could be claimed by medical schools, and there were not many of them. Executions were rare, while students were countless. Each year, the lecture halls grew fuller, the hunger for cadavers more desperate, and the supply thinner. This imbalance created a quiet panic within the medical world. Professors needed bodies to teach. Students needed bodies to learn. Careers, reputations, and the future of medicine itself depended on flesh laid out on cold tables. But the gallows could not keep up. The math was cruel and unavoidable. The science was accelerating, but death was not cooperating. Publicly, Edinburgh celebrated its medical glory. Privately, everyone involved understood the truth. Progress had hit a wall, and that wall was made of law, morality, and an uncomfortable question no one dared to ask out loud. If the dead were not enough, where would the bodies come from? And so, in the shadows of the world's most enlightened medical city, ethics quietly began to decay. What started as an intellectual shortage slowly transformed into a moral vacuum. The pursuit of knowledge did not stop. It never does. It simply began to look for other paths. In Edinburgh, the capital of medicine, the science of healing had unknowingly stepped onto a road where the advancement of knowledge would soon be paid for with human lives, long before those lives were meant to end.
Out of that shortage, a darker economy quietly took shape. It did not announce itself with signs or contracts, but it spread quickly through whispers and night work. A new profession emerged in the alleys and graveyards of Edinburgh, one that existed solely because science refused to slow down. They were called resurrectionists, though the name sounded far cleaner than the work itself. These were men who waited for fresh funerals, who memorized burial schedules, who learned which cemeteries were poorly guarded and which families could not afford heavy coffins or iron cages. They worked after midnight, under rain and fog, moving fast and silently, digging just deep enough to reach what they came for. They did not steal jewelry. They did not care about names or prayers or grief. They wanted bodies, recent ones, before decay ruined their value. A corpse only days old was worth real money, and in a city overflowing with medical schools, demand was constant. The dead were hauled out of graves, stripped of clothing, and delivered through back doors to anatomy theaters before dawn. By morning, the grave would be refilled, often without anyone noticing the difference. Families suspected, but suspicion meant little without proof, and proof was almost impossible to get. What made this trade truly dangerous was not just the men who dug up the bodies, but the silence that greeted them on the other end of the transaction. Doctors knew, professors knew, administrators knew, but no one asked questions that might force answers they did not want to hear. The bodies arrived, Lessons continued, knowledge advanced, and everyone pretended not to notice the dirt still clinging under the fingernails of science. Officially, the medical establishment kept its hands clean. Unofficially, it relied entirely on this shadow market to survive. The law, meanwhile, looked the other way, not out of cruelty, but out of an astonishing oversight. A corpse under British law at the time was not considered property. Stealing a body was not theft in the traditional sense. At worst, it was a minor offense related to disturbing a grave, punishable by small fines or brief imprisonment. The body itself belonged to no one. This legal loophole was fatal. It meant there was profit with almost no risk, and when profit meets desperation, escalation is inevitable. At first, the trade fed on the recently buried. Then cemeteries fought back. Families installed guards. Iron cages, known as morgue safes, were placed over graves. Watchmen were hired. The work became harder, slower, more dangerous. And that was the moment when the unthinkable began to take shape, not in theory, but in practice. Because once bodies became commodities, and once the law failed to protect them, the line between stealing the dead and creating the dead began to blur. In Edinburgh, the dirty solution to a scientific problem had opened a door that should never have existed. And soon, someone would step through it.
Before their names became synonymous with murder, William Burke and William Hare were almost invisible men, the kind the city looked through rather than at. They were not surgeons, not scholars, not masterminds lurking in the shadows of grand institutions. They were ordinary, rough-edged survivors in a city that rewarded ambition but discarded weakness. Burke drifted through life on temporary work and unstable income, while Hare clung to whatever opportunity promised quick money and fewer questions. Together, they found it in a place no one else wanted to look too closely at, a cheap lodging house on the edge of respectability. Their inn was not a place travelers bragged about. It was cramped, poorly kept, and permanently soaked in the smell of damp clothes and desperation. The beds were narrow, the walls thin, and the guests temporary. This was where the poor ended up when they ran out of choices. Day laborers between jobs, beggars looking for shelter, women with nowhere else to go, men already halfway forgotten by society. People arrived without luggage, without letters, often without anyone who would notice if they never left again. Burke and Hare learned something crucial very quickly. Their guests were not connected to the world beyond the room they rented. No families checked in, no employers asked questions. Names were rarely real, and histories were even rarer. When someone disappeared, it was assumed they had simply moved on, as the poor always did. In a city obsessed with progress, these lives barely registered as lives at all. At first, Burke and Hare were not planning crimes. They were opportunists, not predators. They charged rent, served cheap drinks, argued with guests who could not pay, but they were also observant, and in Edinburgh at that time, observation was dangerous. They knew the value of a body. Everyone did. Rumors traveled fast through taverns and back alleys. Universities paid well. Doctors asked no questions, and resurrectionists walked away richer each night. Burke and Hare stood at the intersection of that knowledge and a steady supply no one else had, people who would not be missed. Their lodging house became more than a business. It became a filter. Those who passed through it were already stripped of social protection. They were poor, alone, and invisible, and that invisibility was the most important detail of all. Because long before Burke and Hare ever thought of killing, they had already learned a darker truth about the city they lived in. Some lives were valued only after death, and even then, only for what could be taken from them. The moment that changed everything did not begin with violence, but with inconvenience.
One of the lodgers died quietly in his room, not screaming, not struggling, just another poor soul whose body finally gave up before the city ever noticed he existed. For Hare, the problem was immediate and practical. The man owed him money. A burial would cost more than it returned, time would be lost, and the debt would vanish into the ground along with the body. It was, by every calculation, a loss. That was when the idea surfaced, not as a crime, but as a solution. The dead man no longer needed his body. The city did not care where it went, and Burke and Hare already knew exactly who did. Edinburgh's anatomy rooms were hungry places, filled with students and professors desperate for fresh material, and no name carried more weight than that of Dr. Robert Knox. He was brilliant, famous, admired, a man whose lectures drew crowds and whose reputation stretched far beyond Scotland. If anyone would know what to do with a body, it was him. They wrapped the corpse, replaced its weight in the coffin with junk to avoid suspicion, and carried it through the city not with fear, but with curiosity. This was not a dark alley exchange or a whispered deal. They walked into Knox's world openly, carrying death like merchandise. And Knox did not recoil. He did not ask where the body came from, how it had died, or who it had been. He examined it the way a merchant examines goods, checking freshness, condition, usefulness. Then he paid them a sum so large it barely seemed real. No paperwork, no questions, no moral pause. The money felt different in their hands. It was not like rent money scraped together coin by coin. It was clean, heavy, immediate. In that moment, a line was crossed, not with blood, but with silence. Burke and Hare realized something that could not be unlearned. A dead body was worth more than the living person had ever been, more than weeks of rent, more than honest labor, more than dignity. And more terrifying still was how easy it had been. No alarms, no suspicion, no consequence. The city's greatest medical mind had accepted their offering without hesitation, proving what the streets had whispered all along. In Edinburgh, the value of a human being did not end at death. For some, it only truly began there. After that first sale, waiting for death began to feel like a limitation rather than a fact of life. Corpses were no longer rare accidents to be stumbled upon. They were opportunities that simply required patience. Too much patience. Grave robbing was an option, of course, and many men in Edinburgh already did it. But Burke and Hare quickly understood its flaws. Digging up the dead meant working in darkness, risking discovery, fighting frozen soil, dogs, angry families, and the law when luck ran out. It was dirty work, unpredictable work, and worst of all, it depended on timing. You could not choose when someone would die. But murder removed all uncertainty. The idea did not arrive as a dramatic declaration or a moment of horror. It crept in quietly, wrapped in logic. If the universities needed bodies, and if bodies brought money, then the only real obstacle was supply. Waiting for nature to do the job suddenly seemed inefficient. Killing, by contrast, was faster, cleaner, and infinitely more controllable. No digging, no night patrols, no risks of exhumation. Just a body, fresh and undamaged, delivered straight from life to the anatomy table. They did not sit down and announce the decision to become killers. There was no oath, no confession, no shaking hands over blood. It was understood, a shared glance, a silence that lingered too long. The realization that once you accept a dead man as currency, the living begin to look like inventory. Every guest who passed through their lodging house, every poor soul who needed a bed, a drink, or a bit of kindness became something else in their minds, a potential specimen. And the city made it easier. These were people no one tracked, no one protected, no one expected to be seen again. The lonely, the drunk, the forgotten.
Their absence would raise no alarms, their deaths would spark no investigations. In a place where the poor vanished every day, murder could hide in plain sight. That was the true transformation, not from honest men to criminals, but from seeing death as an end to seeing it as a product, from waiting for bodies to deciding to manufacture them. And once that thought settled in, there was no going back. Edinburgh had taught them a terrible lesson. If science would buy corpses without asking questions, then the only question left was how many could be made.
What made Burke and Hare truly dangerous was not just that they decided to kill, but that they engineered killing to serve science. This was not rage, not panic, not violence born of chaos. It was calculated, quiet, and optimized. They needed bodies that would satisfy anatomists, and anatomists demanded one thing above all else: intact flesh. No broken bones, no stab wounds, no bruises that might raise suspicion. The corpse had to look as though life had simply slipped away. So they refined a method. It usually began with hospitality. A drink offered, another poured. Alcohol softened resistance, dulled awareness, loosened the boundary between trust and danger. The victim would grow heavy, slow, their words slurring, their bodies surrendering before their mind understood what was happening. Once consciousness faded, the violence began, but never in a way that left marks. One man would press his weight onto the chest, not violently, just enough to prevent breath from fully entering the lungs. The other would close off the remaining escape of air, sealing mouth and nose with practiced precision. There was no struggle that left evidence, no thrashing that bruised skin. The death was silent, suffocating, clinical. Minutes later, life was gone, and what remained looked eerily untouched. This was murder designed backwards from the autopsy table. The genius of the method, if it can be called that, was how invisible it was. No blood, no obvious trauma, no wounds for a coroner to question. To an untrained eye, the victim appeared to have died naturally, perhaps from drink, illness, or exhaustion. To a surgeon, the body was perfect, muscles unbroken, organs pristine, a specimen that could be studied without interruption. And it worked, every time. Soon, this method became their signature, so consistent that it earned a name: Burking, a word born not in courts or newspapers, but whispered in medical circles, describing a way to kill without leaving evidence. The term would eventually enter dictionaries, an unsettling reminder that language itself had absorbed their crime. That is the most chilling part. Their technique did not horrify medicine enough to be rejected. It fascinated it. The bodies arrived clean, the lessons were clear, the students learned, and as long as the corpses kept coming, no one asked how they were made. Burke and Hare had turned murder into a service industry, death, stripped of drama and pain, repackaged as supply. And in doing so, they crossed a line far darker than killing itself. They aligned violence with progress and made it efficient.
They did not hunt randomly, and that may be the most disturbing detail of all. Burke and Hare understood the city better than any map could show it. They knew who mattered, and, more importantly, who did not. Their victims were not chosen for who they were, but for how little noise their absence would make. The poor, the homeless, the forgotten, people whose lives barely registered in official records and whose deaths would dissolve into silence. Many were travelers passing through Edinburgh, faces no one would recognize again. Others were women living on the margins, already treated as invisible by society, their struggles ignored long before their bodies were stolen. Some were mentally disabled, familiar figures on the streets, known by nicknames rather than names, tolerated rather than protected. A few were simply alone, no family, no friends, no one to knock on doors asking questions when they vanished. This was not cruelty driven by impulse, it was selection driven by calculation. Burke and Hare understood a brutal truth about their time. Justice followed status. A missing aristocrat would trigger panic. A missing merchant would raise alarms. But a missing beggar? A drunk? A poor woman renting a bed for the night? The city would shrug and move on. Poverty itself became a shield for the killers, not because it protected the victims, but because it erased them. Their lodging house was perfectly designed for this purpose. It attracted exactly the kind of people the city had already abandoned. Warmth, cheap drink, a place to sleep, small comforts that lowered defenses. Trust grew easily when survival depended on kindness, and that trust was exploited with terrifying efficiency. What makes this pattern so unsettling is that it reflects more than individual evil. It exposes a social hierarchy where some lives were implicitly considered expendable. Burke and Hare did not invent this system, they simply weaponized it. They killed where society had already decided not to look. Each murder was made possible long before the act itself by neglect, inequality, and indifference. The victims were chosen not because they were weak, but because the world around them had already agreed they were disposable. And that silent agreement is what allowed the bodies to keep moving from the shadows of Edinburgh's streets straight onto the bright tables of scientific progress.
In just a span of less than 12 months, Burke and Hare transformed their grim enterprise into a relentless machine. From 1827 to 1828, 16 bodies, 16 human lives passed through their hands, each one a calculated step toward profit and scientific curiosity. The numbers alone make the stomach churn, but the true horror lies not in the tally, but in what happened after death. These were not anonymous skeletons dug from the earth. They were warm, fresh, still tangible bodies, stripped of their dignity and funneled directly onto the tables of Edinburgh's most prestigious anatomy halls. For the medical students and Dr. Robert Knox himself, it was a revelation. Tissue so fresh that veins still held the faint echo of life, muscles taut and pliable under the scalpel, brains unspoiled and perfect for dissection. They observed without hesitation, without moral pause, focusing solely on the educational goldmine before them. Each body became a living textbook, teaching lessons in human anatomy that no corpse dug from the grave could provide. There were no signs of struggle, no telltale marks of violence. The meticulousness of Burke and Hare ensured that science saw only perfection, untouched by the chaos of murder. But while the scalpel traced muscle fibers and exposed hidden organs, the humanity of each victim was invisible. The laughter, the fears, the desperation, the whispered prayers in the dark of that final night, all erased in the name of education. The anatomy hall witnessed only what it wanted: pristine specimens for learning, stripped of context, history, and life. In those walls, the dead became purely objects, and the living were reduced to statistics, their stories swallowed by the hungry appetite of medical progress. And all the while, the city outside moved on, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge the shadow commerce feeding its brightest minds.
Robert Knox stood at the center of his anatomy theater, a towering figure of authority whose reputation stretched far beyond Edinburgh. His lectures drew crowds of eager students, all hungry for knowledge, all willing to suspend moral judgment for the sake of learning. But fame has a shadow, and that shadow revealed itself in the most disturbing of ways when Daft Jamie, a young man familiar to the city streets, arrived on the dissection table. Students gasped, murmurs rippled through the hall, and recognition flashed in their eyes. This was no anonymous corpse. This was someone who had lived, laughed, stumbled through the same alleys they walked every day. a boy whose life had ended far too early, and yet here he was, dissected before them, a specimen. Knox's response was immediate, almost rehearsed. He ignored the protests, the whispered recognition, the moral alarm bells that should have rung in any ethical mind. Instead, he worked with precision and urgency, stripping away the face, obliterating any features that could connect this body to a living, breathing human being. To the students, it became just another object, another opportunity to study muscle fibers, sinew, and bone. The boy's identity evaporated beneath the scalpel, replaced by charts, diagrams, and academic notes. This was not ignorance. Knox knew exactly who he was dissecting, and in his denial, in his methodical erasure of the human features, there lay a silent complicity far more chilling than any overt crime. He had built a wall between science and morality, and behind that wall, ethics did not exist. Here, in the shadowed corners of one of Europe's most celebrated medical institutions, the line between education and exploitation blurred, and the curious pursuit of knowledge became entwined with a quiet, deliberate disregard for human dignity. This was a theater of learning, yes, but also a stage upon which complicity, ambition, and moral blindness performed a chilling, unspoken act.
The tension had been simmering for months in that grim Edinburgh lodging house, a tension no one fully understood until the moment it erupted with undeniable clarity. One of the residents, a woman who had lived in the shadows of society and endured enough neglect to sharpen her instincts, began noticing the subtle inconsistencies. The quiet trips by Burke and Hare to the back rooms, the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered, the strange odors that she could neither name nor place. Her curiosity, born of necessity and survival, became suspicion. One afternoon, driven by a mixture of fear and resolve, she decided to look. She searched where most would never dare, and there, under a loose floorboard beneath the bed where so many vulnerable souls had slept, she discovered a corpse. It was the undeniable proof, the irrefutable evidence of what had been whispered in corners but never fully acknowledged. These men, the keepers of the lodging house, were not just opportunists, they were deliberate killers. Her scream, sharp and raw, shattered the quiet, alerting neighbors and authorities alike. The police arrived swiftly, moving through the narrow streets of Edinburgh as though a dark secret had finally been dragged into the daylight. Burke and Hare, the men whose calm demeanor had masked unspeakable acts, were seized. There was no room for denial, no chance to craft another lie. This time, the body under the floorboard spoke louder than any alibi. The arrests shocked the city, but what truly rippled through Edinburgh was the horror of realization. The victims had been ordinary people, invisible to society, easily overlooked, and yet they had been methodically extinguished to feed the insatiable hunger of medical ambition. The city, steeped in its reverence for knowledge and scientific progress, had ignored the human cost for far too long. Burke and Hare's capture marked not only the end of their private reign of terror, but also the beginning of an era in which the darkness behind the pursuit of anatomy could no longer remain hidden under the shadows of convenience and silence. The thin line between necessity and immorality had been crossed, and the consequences were about to unfold in ways that would haunt Edinburgh for generations.
The courtroom in Edinburgh was thick with tension, the air heavy with the smell of candle wax and the murmurs of a public hungry for scandal and retribution. William Hare, the smaller, wiry man who had always operated in the shadows of Burke's imposing figure, saw an opportunity to save himself when the walls closed in. With calculated words, he pointed fingers, recounted events in a way that painted Burke as the mastermind, the orchestrator, while he, Hare, claimed a reluctant role, swept along by circumstance. The judges, the jury, the entire city, they needed a culprit,
a symbol, and Hare became the convenient scapegoat. He walked out of the courtroom free, his name vanishing into the fog of Edinburgh's alleys, a ghost who had escaped punishment, leaving the heavier, more deliberate Burke to bear the full weight of justice. Burke, by contrast, faced the full machinery of a legal system that sought both retribution and deterrence. His demeanor, once calm and calculating, now betrayed cracks of fear as the sentence was read. Guilty of multiple murders, the finality of the verdict struck with the weight of inevitability: death. The city, hungry for moral closure, watched as the law executed its function. But the unevenness of the outcome, the freedom of Hare, the certainty of Burke's doom, highlighted a grim pragmatism at the heart of justice. It was a justice that balanced fear, politics, and public spectacle more than moral consistency. In the eyes of Edinburgh, the scales had tipped not towards fairness, but towards the expediency of an example, a warning etched into the city's memory that even in the pursuit of knowledge, morality could be bent, sacrificed, or entirely ignored when survival and power hung in the balance.
The execution was carried out in the cold light of an Edinburgh morning, the streets crowded with citizens, some curious, some horrified, all bearing witness to the final act in a drama that had gripped the city for over a year. William Burke, once a man of cunning and control, now dangled from the rope, his life snuffed out in an instant, leaving behind only the echoes of his crimes. But the story did not end there, for the law, the city, and the medical establishment had decided that Burke's death alone was insufficient. His body, still warm, was claimed by the very institutions he had served through his murders, destined to become the ultimate teaching tool. In the lecture halls of Edinburgh, students gathered, their eyes wide, some with fascination, others with a gnawing sense of unease, as Burke's cadaver was dissected methodically before them. Every cut, every exposed muscle, every carefully preserved organ became a grim illustration of anatomy, but also a haunting reminder of the human cost behind medical progress. The professor guiding the lesson spoke with precision, as if the terror and betrayal in Burke's life were merely footnotes to the pursuit of knowledge. The crowd outside would later speak in whispers about the irony. The man who had created so many cadavers for profit now lay in the same position, stripped, studied, objectified, becoming both lesson and warning. The judge's words resonated through time. Let his body be a lesson as he made others' bodies lessons. And indeed, Burke's body, the vessel that once concealed a predator, now transformed into an instrument of pedagogy, became a dark monument to the intersection of crime, morality, and science. The city watched, the students learned, and history recorded a paradox so bitter it seemed almost theatrical. The killer became the ultimate subject of his own discipline, illustrating not just the secrets of human anatomy, but the peril of a science untempered by ethics. In every slice and exposure, the truth was clear. Knowledge gained without conscience is a blade that cuts both ways. Even after the last breath left William Burke's body, the story refused to rest in the shadows. His skeleton, carefully cleaned and mounted, became a macabre exhibit, displayed for generations to gape at and study, a silent narrator of horror and curiosity intertwined. Students of medicine stared at the bones, memorizing the structure, the angles, the subtle asymmetries that make a human body unique, yet always with the unspoken knowledge that this particular set of bones had once belonged to a man who had weaponized life itself. But the grotesque fascination did not end there. From his skin, a strange relic was made, a wallet, a tactile reminder of the corporeal reality that had fueled his crimes. And in an almost ritualistic twist, his blood was used to inscribe his own name, an eerie signature that blurred the line between punishment and spectacle, memory and warning. The city and the medical community transformed Burke's remains into a symbol, one that communicated multiple uncomfortable truths simultaneously: the lure of scientific discovery, the hunger for knowledge at any cost, the fragility of morality when opportunity and greed collide. In every lecture hall, every whispered anecdote among students, every curious visitor in a dimly lit cabinet, the lessons of Burke's life and death lived on. The man who had taken lives to fuel the advancement of medicine had himself been reduced to anatomy, a cautionary tale etched into bone, skin, and ink. His body, fragmented and repurposed, became an icon of transgression and education fused together, a constant reminder that the pursuit of knowledge without conscience does not merely corrupt the individual, it leaves an indelible mark on society, on ethics, and on the very fabric of what it means to call oneself human. Burke's legacy, morbid and fascinating, endures not because of what he did, but because of how his body became a story that the world could not look away from. A story of crime, science, and the horrifying power of human ambition left unchecked.
The shocking legacy of Burke and Hare did not vanish with their capture or with Burke's execution. It seeped into the very laws that would govern medical practice in Britain. The Anatomy Act of 1832 emerged as a direct response, a legal framework that finally allowed medical schools access to unclaimed bodies, those who died in workhouses or hospitals without relatives, eliminating the need for grave robbing and, in theory, preventing another Burke and Hare. Yet this law also cast a long shadow. It revealed a bitter paradox. Progress in science often comes trailing a wake of human suffering, a reminder that the hunger for knowledge can outpace morality. The Anatomy Act codified a solution, but the specter of ethical compromise lingered, proving that a society can legislate bodies but cannot legislate conscience. Ultimately, the tale of Burke and Hare is not merely about two men who murdered to feed the curiosity of doctors. It is a story about a broken system, about silence where there should have been outrage, about ambition that trampled humanity. It is a narrative that forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. How many atrocities are hidden behind the guise of progress? And how often does the drive for discovery excuse acts that would be unconscionable in any other context? Their story is a grim reminder that science without ethics is not just dangerous, it is monstrous. And the cost of that monstrosity is written in lives, in bones, and in the haunting echoes of human greed. Burke and Hare may have died, but the questions they leave behind about morality, law, and the insatiable drive to know will endure far longer than any single generation of anatomists.